Alright, so I've finished my sweater, and as you can see, my sleeve is a little bit too short. And so it's not the end of the world. I need to lengthen the sleeve a little bit. So the first question is, by how much? I think ideally, I would like my cuff to be right about here, sort of even with the edge of my wrist here. So I need another 2 inches of length on my sweater. All right, let's talk about how I might achieve that. So here is my finished sleeve, and if I want to add 2 inches of length to it, I think probably the best place to do that would be right in here. I could, could add it in anywhere, but I'm thinking close to the cuff will be the right place. Because the sleeve is knit from the cuff up, if I were to, say, snip a stitch and remove the cuff here and knit in the opposite direction and then reattach the cuff, I'll end up with a little bit of a problem in that the direction of the knitting is different. When you knit in this direction, your stitches will be they will be facing this direction, and when you pick up and knit in the other direction, where you join your yarn in and start to knit, you're actually knitting the stitches in between the previous stitches. It's a little complicated to understand unless you do it, so take my word for it at this point that if I were to snip my cuff off and then knit in stockinette stitch in this direction, you will see a line in the knitting where I've done that. So what I'm going to do is undo my seam here at the cuff. I will separate the cuff somewhere in here, and then what I'm going to do is pick one of these patterns, maybe this one. Maybe just put a little ridge in, and I'll pick one of these patterns, this one, or this one, or this one, and I'll add it as a decorative element just above my cuff, and then do the cuff again. So that's my plan for lengthening my sleeves. I'll pick a pattern that is 2 inches in length. So this pattern at the base. See this pattern here at the base of my at the base of the Gansey here. That might be a nice little pattern, decorative pattern to put into the cuff of my sleeve. So let me get started on that and take you along with me on my journey in case you would like to do the same thing. So the first thing is to find out where my seam is, and I should have, again, shoulda, coulda, woulda, I should have tried on my sweater before I wove in my ends, because now finding my stitches, of course, is going to be a little bit harder. So what I'm doing here is I'm finding the seam on the inside. I can see where I grafted my stitches together here, and I can just barely see my seaming thread. If I pull hard on here, you can kind of see the horizontal thread, the horizontal yarn that I used to seam it together. So I'm going to find one, just pulling really hard in here until I can see air between my side seams. So I'm pulling apart the seams on the inside and the outside to find a horizontal bar that will be my seaming bar. And when I find that one, I'm going to snip it. And I'll just use my wool needle to undo the seam here. There, that should give me enough room to work in. And I'm going to look at my pattern here. So I'm thinking that what I'm going to do is do one row of pearls, do a row of purl stitches like I've got here, and then insert this, what was this one called? The parallelograms pattern right there, and then do one more row of purl stitches and then finish off with my rib stitches. So where I'm going to insert this little pattern detail is right above the cuff. That'll save me from re-knitting more stuff. So I'm going to remove just the part above the cuff, and again, I can't unravel the ribbing from this end. I can't pull back the ribbing to here and then re-knit it. I need to remove the cuff because it's very difficult to undo the ribbing from the cast on edge. It's not like pulling back from the bind off edge. When you undo from the cast on edge, especially in any kind of pattern stitch, you will have to untangle, unweave that yarn from each row. So it's, I don't recommend it. What I do recommend is just removing the cuff. You can still recondition the yarn, you can re-knit it, or we could Kitchener stitch it back on again, but I'll just re-knit the cuff when it's time to do that. And so, well, how I'm going to begin this is to snip a stitch right above the cuff. Again, the easiest place to find this is to just work back from the purl stitches on the cuff. Here, the knit stitches go directly into the stockinette fabric, but where the purl stitches meet the stockinette fabric, you get a different stitch. So there's a knit stitch right on top of the cuff. See that? There's my purl bump, and there's my knit stitch. And so I'm going to snip this knit stitch right in the middle of the cuff line. And then just using my sewing needle here, I'm going to start to undo the stitches. So one of the reasons why I like to begin when I'm snipping a stitch in the middle of the place I'm taking apart is because it's easier to find the right stitch there in the middle. And as you can see here on the edge, I'm running into a place where I've woven in my end from a side seam or from rejoining a piece of yarn, and so those along the edges you can run into stuff like that, which so you may end up snipping the wrong thing. So that's those are a couple of reasons why I like to begin in the middle. Another reason for starting in the middle is that then the yarn that you're pulling out only spans halfway across the row. So technically this piece of yarn that I'm pulling out is shorter on either end, because I didn't start from the left side and work to the right, or from the right side and work to the left. I started in the middle, and I'm working out to either edge of my garment. I could snip this yarn that I'm pulling out, so it's not really a big deal, but I kind of like to preserve as much yarn as possible. Alright, so there we go. I've released the cuff from the bottom of my sweater, and I've got these stitches now are live and ready to go back on a needle. So I'll do that next before I remove the other cuff. I knit my sweater on a 4.5mm needle. Looks like I have to go find the other half of my needle. But for putting stitches back onto a needle, I'm just going to use the smallest needles in my interchangeable set. If you have a spare set of needles hanging around somewhere, they might be straight needles, it might be a circular sock needle, just for putting stitches back onto a cord. You don't need to have the right size needles. You can use any size needle, especially if it's shorter. Especially if it's smaller than the one that you used to knit the stitches with. The stitches will go back on to your needle easier with a smaller needle tip. Okay, so I'm just going to grab my stitches here, and again I've washed the sleeve so you can see the stitches are behaving quite nicely. They're not going anywhere. And I'm just going to slip them back onto my needle, inserting the needle into the back of the stitch and sliding the loops forward. And see how nicely they just slip on there? Now if you were, I'm having to slide my cord through because my sleeve has been partially sewn up here, so it doesn't want to conform to a straight needle. So if you were working with a straight needle and doing this, you might have to undo the seam, the side seam, a little bit more than what I have done in order to accommodate the straight needle, in order for your sleeve to lay flat. There we go. My stitches are back onto a cord. I'll adjust the needle tips a little bit later. I've got all my stitches picked up along here. Okay, so now I'm going to do the same procedure to the other sleeve, and when I have it on the needle like this one, I'll be back. Okay, so I have my stitches back on my needle. I found my right size millimeter tips, and I've put all of my all of my sleeve stitches back on one circular needle. My intention is to work the stitches simultaneously, to work the sleeves simultaneously. So I will work one row on the wrong side and then work one row on the right side, back and forth, doing each row as I come to it. In consideration of which pattern I decided to pick, I thought a lot about all the options that I have on my sweater to make it matching at the cuff, and I decided that what I would do, because my diagonal pattern was a little too thick for what I wanted to do, I thought what I would do is actually work these stacked brick patterns. And so what I'm going to do is a row of garter stitch like we have here in the pattern, and then I'm going to work some stacked bricks until I get to the my 2 inches, the extra 2 inches that I want to add. When I pulled out my yarn from my cuffs, I ended up with a purl side facing me, so you can see my yarn on both sides of my sleeves is on the purl side. But at this point it doesn't really matter whether I start with a knit row or a purl row. So I do want to begin my patterning on the right side. So in order to get my garter stitch row in there, I'm going to begin with the right side facing and ignore the fact that I have some yarn left over here on the wrong side. For what I'm about to do, it doesn't matter which side I begin on. The other thing I need to think about before I get started is that the pattern that I'm going to use is a multiple of 4 stitches plus 2. And so I have here on my needles, I happen to have 51 stitches. So the closest multiple of 4 stitches is 48, plus 2 is 50. So I will have 1 extra stitch here on the edge that I will just work into my salvage stitches. So when I get there, what I'll do is the 48 stitches leaves 3 over. So I'm just going to put in a stitch marker here. There's 2 stitches on this side. And I'll put in a stitch marker here. And I'll do the same thing on the next sleeve. 2 stitches here. And 1 stitch at the end. And those stitch markers will remind me that before and after the stitch markers on each row, I'm just going to knit those stitches, and in between I'll do my pattern stitch, and that should work out just fine. So that's what I'm going to do right now, and I am going to use fresh yarn for this. So while I'm working on my sleeve lengthening project, the yarn for my cuff is sitting in a wash, in a bath, being reconditioned for me to use it again on the cuffs if I want to, or in another project later on. So I'm just going to grab my new yarn here. Got a little fresh ball here. I'll need 2 balls actually to do 2 sleeves at once. I'll have to join in a second ball of yarn. And remember I said you couldn't just go directly into stockinette stitch, so I'm going to begin with a little border that is garter stitch. And to do that, I'm going to purl on this side. So I'm just going to insert my needle like this, take my yarn, wrap it around. Remember this, we just start with a loop. I'm going to purl that first stitch, and then I'm going to purl the next stitch doubled up just to anchor my yarn. Pass my little stitch marker over. And then just using the yarn that's attached to the ball, I'm going to carry on across the row, working my purl stitches. So I will purl on the right side and knit on the wrong side. Or will I purl on the wrong side? I'll decide when I get there. Let me just see if I can find it in the pattern somewhere. Now if you're doing this as well, if you're working on 2 things at a time, sometimes it's helpful to know which was the first thing that you started with. So what you can do is attach a locking stitch marker to the fabric of the first sleeve. So this is the first sleeve on the right side, and so if I get turned around and I don't remember which sleeve is the one that I started on, the little marker there will tell you where you began. Okay, when I get to the end of the first sleeve, just push those stitches down, mount your second sleeve up onto the needle, grab your second ball of yarn, and do the same thing. Okay, so I'm just going to add another 2 inches of pattern knitting to my sleeves, and then I'm going to carry on in the rib stitch for the cuff, and I will be done. When I get to the end of this row, I'm just going to check my pattern and make sure that I have my locking stitch markers in the right place, because I want the pattern to be consistent. So I'm going to double check that when I get to the end of this row. Okay, so I'm just working backwards on my sleeves here to plan this out. So when I began my sleeves, I started off with, in this case, 58 stitches. And then I did a decrease row where I decreased to 6 stitches. And then, I decreased 6 stitches. So I ended up with 52 stitches for my sleeve. And the reason that I've got 51 instead of 52 stitches here is because you may remember that I told you when you pick up stitches working in the opposite direction, you're actually picking up the, I didn't say this, but you're picking up the loops in between the loops as you're knitting them. It's kind of a weird explanation, but that's why you have 50, that's why I have 51 stitches instead of 52. So your knit stitches kind of fit together a bit like this. And when you, so here you can see on one hand I've got four fingers, one, two, three, four, and in between them I can fit 3 fingers. When I pull those rows apart, you'll see that one side has fewer stitches than the other. Okay, and so I'm on the side that has one less stitch, and so I'll need to make some adjustments. I mean, I could increase this to 52. I can leave it at 51. It really doesn't make any difference right now as far as the pattern's concerned. I might actually just change it to 52 because that's what the pattern called for, plus that would allow me to have kind of these extra 2 stitches on either side rather than 1 on one side and 2 on the other, which just might feel a little more symmetrical. And then when I'm ready to continue the ribbing, I will increase my stitches. But what that means is that my plan in terms of continuing on with this pattern is going to be disrupted because I'll have this pattern, but I have to increase 6 stitches, and it'll look a little funny to have a place where, you know, you might have 3 purl stitches instead of 2 as you go across the row. So what I will do then is use this pattern but do another row of this garter stitch here before I start my ribbing, and that way I can hide the increases. Everything will look really nice and neat, and it won't be continuous, but that's okay. The other thing I wanted to check on was how to make this, so I'm just referring back to the pattern. Yeah, so when I made this one here, the instructions were to purl 2 rows, and so I've purled 1 row. So now I'll turn and I'll purl back, and then I'll begin my stacked bricks patterning. All right, wish me luck, and I'll see you here when my sleeves are done.